All right, so this second part is going to move to observations. And so the observations are from the Benguela upwelling region. So the Benguela upwelling region is one of the 4 major eastern boundary upwelling regions in the ocean. And so they are caused by a long front winds and then offshore Ekman transport. And then you have upwelling of cold waters along the coast. And here is one example actually of a study with CCSM4, Global Coarse Resolution Climate Models, that shows that especially, so there is actually an SST bias in these upwelling regions. And the SST bias is actually particularly large in this Benguela upwelling region. So a feature of these upwelling regions are those submesoscale filaments. So those filaments consist of cold water that are drawn out by mostly counter-rotating eddies offshore from these upwelling regions. And here you can see in the satellite SST image example of those filaments. So there was a cruise to the Benguela upwelling region where we discovered one such filament. And so it was sampled across. So you see here the ship track. And we also had some drifters deployed at these locations here to study mixing and turbulence around the filament in this region. So here you see the filament again in a little bit of a higher resolution from a satellite image. So sometimes it's hard to get these satellite images because you have clouds, because this was a cloud-free day. So it has a nice picture of the filament. And here you also have eddies that are shown from SSH data. So you see here these 2 counter-rotating eddies that were responsible for drawing out this filament. And one special thing about this Benguela region compared to the other eastern boundary upwelling regions, it has a particularly high eddy kinetic energy. And this stems from the Agulhas eddies that are coming here from the south. And this was actually an Agulhas eddy that was advected here into this region. So it's a region with particularly large eddy kinetic energy. And here you see a typical transect through across this filament with the cold water in the middle. So I'm going to focus, so we had actually several measurements here. We had glider measurements with microstructure, dissipation observations. Then you have a scanfish observations of temperature, salinity, velocity. So scanfish is something that you pull behind your ship and it kind of measures profiles. And then we're also using SSH data and ship ADCP data. But I'm going to mainly focus on Lagrangian stuff. So we deployed drifters. So these are buoys that have a drogue at 15-meter depth. So they are supposed to monitor currents basically in the mixed layer. And so these are typical drifters that are also deployed in the global drifter program, which is a program that deploys constantly drifters all across the ocean. So there's always about like 3,000 or 4,000 or so that are in the ocean monitoring the currents at a relatively small scale, depending on what your observation interval is actually. So our observational interval was actually every 30 minutes. The position and sea surface temperature was transmitted. So since I've shown previously diffusivities from the mesoscale currents in an eddy resolving model in the first part, I'm now showing you diffusivities that we derived from those actual drifter trajectories in the ocean. And so since we want to isolate eddy effects, we also have to use some product for the mean currents. So we're using the Oscar surface current product that is mainly a satellite-derived product. It also has an Ekman velocity in there. So what you see here is a mean velocity derived from this product in the region. And here you also see a snapshot of the velocities, showing you the eddy activity. So now we're using the concept of pseudo-trajectories that was introduced also by Davis in a very famous paper about diffusivities, where you could actually relate the Lagrange diffusivity to the mean tracer gradients. So we are interpolating this mean velocity to the float positions, and then you subtract the mean velocity from the velocity that you get from your floats, and this gives you the prime. And then you integrate this velocity in time, and that gives you your so-called pseudo trajectories. So this is a different approach, as if, because we don't. So in a model, of course, you have the total field available, but here we only have those drifter positions that give us the total velocity field. And so we are using this concept of pseudo trajectories. We are also using pseudo trajectories based on just the daily mean velocities. So when you subtract the daily velocities that you get from these snapshots, so this gives you then the effect of sort of sub-daily contributions. So what you see here is, for instance, for the observations in black, you have the real trajectories. In blue, you will have the pseudo trajectories when your mean flow is removed. And then here, this would actually be kind of your sub-daily and sub. So this is about at a resolution of 25 kilometers minimum. So this would give you kind of the sub-daily, sub-25 kilometer motions. Okay, now we can use these pseudo trajectories and the associated velocities to estimate diffusivities again, right? So, and we can actually now estimate the full diffusivity tensor, which is also not usually done, actually. People focus usually on one component, but we're now diagnosing the full tensor. And so here I'm showing the XX component, here the XY component, here the YY component. And so the red is from the actual trajectories. So when you do not subtract the mean flow and you see that the diffusivities don't converge well. So you, especially in the XX component, you see a continuously increasing diffusivity, and that is due to your background mean shear. So that is why if you subtract the mean flow, you actually see that even in your XX component, your diffusivity converges, and also in your XY component. So we see that generally you have a very large anisotropy. So if you calculate the eigenvalues, you see that even your second eigenvalue gets negative, which can occur, right, if these two are very different or if this is very large. And now we can also, from our sub-daily contribution, diagnose the diffusivities, and we find that those are also still anisotropic and account actually to about 14% of the total diffusion. Now we looked at the diffusive regime, but from classical, so this is really classical turbulence statistics, we can now also look at two-particle dispersion. So instead of having these single particle diffusivities, right, we now look at the displacement or the separation of two particles. So the mean square displacement here, it's also a tensor. And if we then have an underlying kinetic energy spectrum, then there are those classical predictions that you have. So we have, for steeper spectra, we have the so-called non-local dispersion, and that is dominated by eddies that have a scale that is larger than the separation. So then your mean square displacement, it increases exponentially with time. For shallower spectra, you get so-called local dispersion, right, where you have it is dominated by eddies that have that are at the same scale as your separation. And of course, you get the famous Richardson regime for your spectral slope of 5/3, where your mean square displacement grows cubically, and you have this famous relation of the diffusivities that goes with the separation to the power of 4/3. Now, diffusion we've already looked at. So the kappa is now twice, so this pair particle diffusivity is twice the single particle diffusivity. Now we can look at this mean square. So the dispersion, actually, the root mean square displacement, and what we find is we do have a very nice fit actually to the local regime. So it's an exponential here. Then we do have a Richardson regime here, and then we have the diffusive regime here for larger scales. Now it should be stressed that it is really important to have a very small initial separation distance for your particles. Because, which we had, so we were deploying them in triplets with a separation of about 200 meters. And if you use a separation distance that is too large, you are not covering these regimes correctly. Okay, so what you can also use is finite size Lyapunov exponents. So this mean squared pair separation is like a fixed time measure. And then you have a fixed scale measure. It's a finite size Lyapunov exponents. So where here you measure, so this tau of delta is the averaged time for drifter pairs initially separate by this distance delta to reach a distance alpha delta. And then you can diagnose this FSLE coefficient. And here I want to show you an example actually of the intermittency of these drifter separations. So here you have 3 drifters that are close together, but then suddenly one of this drifter separates, and this is what you see. And this shows you have kind of an intermittency in this field. And so there are predictions for this finite size Lyapunov exponent. So for the non-local regime, it should actually be constant. For the local regime, it goes like delta to the power of minus 2/3. And so what we see is for the total deployment is we get actually controversial results, because here for small scales, it's not constant, but it goes like delta to the power of minus 2/3. And this can actually be resolved if you look at 2 releases separately. So for the northern release, you then get a constant, which as expected, and it corresponds to the fixed time scale diagnostics. And for the southern deployment, you actually get this. So the northern regime is dominated by this fixed time scale regime, and the southern release is correctly represented then by the FSLE. So this shows just simply with this, I just wanted to illustrate that sampling matters. And so the message so far is from the particle dispersion that all tensor components converge if the local mean throw is subtracted. There is a large anisotropy, and I think one should take into account actually the long filament diffusion. And I think that could maybe eliminate some of this SST bias that we've been seeing. Subdaily variation contributes 14%. And the relative dispersion actually shows something that is typical for 2D turbulence dynamics. So this exponential regime that is consistent with steep slopes. Then we have the Richardson regime that is consistent with the k to the minus 5/3. Yeah, and sampling matters. So now I want to go towards slow spectra. So there have been in the ocean, as some of you probably know, lots of estimates from spectra at meso to submesoscale transition from ship track ADCP velocity data. And so this is one prominent example. So from Carlos and Ferrari, where you see that in the Gulf Stream region, you get actually a steep slope that would be more consistent with interior QG. When you do a Helmholtz decomposition, then you also get a dominance of rotational parts. Whereas in the subtropical North Pacific, you get shallower slopes, and you get these 2 divergent and rotational components that are more comparable to each other. So now there have been many studies on this in different regions from ship tracks. And so you get different slopes, you get different transition scales to rotational dominated part. And one outcome, for instance, is that the more mesoscale eddy kinetic energy you have, it's kind of logical, then the smaller your transition scale is. Okay, so we can also look from our ship track data, we can also look at the kinetic energy spectra. So they're averaged over several ship tracks and then also over the mixed layer depth. And so what we are finding is relatively shallow spectra that are actually close to -5/3 for scales below the Rossby radius. And arguably there is some steepening, but it's not really statistically significant. And then we see that the rotational component actually decreases for scales that are larger than about 20 kilometers. So which is around the Rossby radius. So the Rossby radius is 30 kilometers. So we get actually a relatively small transition scale compared to the other studies because we have a large mesoscale kinetic energy. So now we move on again to the spectral fluxes. So I've already shown the satellite observations or a plot in the previous part. So it is really challenging to observe, get observations of the spectral fluxes, right? So because you need really good data and gridded data. And so satellite observations barely resolve the deformation radius. And we are going to rely on improvements from this new satellite SWAT mission. And they capture the part of the inverse cascade regimes, but the conclusions about scales smaller than 100 kilometers are really debatable. And so there was one study by Garabato et al. Where they used velocity estimates from a mooring array. And then there's a structure function method. So we have already, so it's also a classic statistical method. So some of you actually know much more about this than I do. I'm very happy to get tips. So we've already actually heard about this method in a talk on, I think, Monday. And so it is actually really kind of a nice thing, a nice idea, because to wanting to apply them to drifter data, right? Because drifter data are unstructured and you cannot really use spectra, but we have a lot of drifter observations in the ocean. So we wanted to try it, but it is challenging to apply to. And so we are also going to use the structure function method on our drifters. Okay, first, again, some overview of some modeling results on some modeling examples about spectral fluxes, because a lot has been done with models, right? So this is showing you kind of an ED channel model in simulations with different Rossby numbers and Richardson numbers. So you go here from red to blue, from small Rossby number to large Rossby number. And then you can also look at the relative importance of rotational and divergent parts, and also at the spectral fluxes. So what you see here, the larger your Rossby number gets, is the larger your forward cascade becomes, and this is here the divergent parts and the rotational parts. Okay, the structure function method. As I said, I'm not an expert on this, but we are using it. So it was introduced already on Monday. So it is based on it's really a most classical turbulence method. So it's based on the velocity difference, and you can actually project it in a long and transverse way. So this is the longitudinal structure function, and it is related to the energy spectrum like this with this zero-order Bessel function. And you can actually, if you have an energy spectrum that goes like k to the minus alpha, you can put this in here, right? Then you get kind of two integrals, and then you can actually see that for smaller length scales, the energy contributes to the second order structure function, and for larger scales, it is the entropy that contributes. And from here, you can also kind of get the relation to the slopes. So the second order structure function scales like r to the power of 2/3, you get an alpha equals 5/3. And if alpha goes to 3, you get r to the power of 2. Okay, so then we can do this. We can apply this method on our unstructured drifter data. So we are just saying, okay, our drifter data, we treat them as scattered Eulerian velocity points, right? And then we do this structure function. And what we find is, yeah, so this shows the second order structure function. And you do see, you get kind of two regimes where you have a scaling of s to the power of 2/3 for smaller scales, and then again one for larger scales. But then there's here this transition zone where you have actually steeper transition. So you can also use the structure function to estimate the Rossby number as a function of scale. So what you see here, actually dividing into two releases again. So the blue one is actually a release that is close, that is in the filament where you have strong fronts. The other one is more closer to the upwelling region. So what you see here is that for larger separation distances, these two agree, but then they separate here at a scale of around 10 kilometers, and then the Rossby numbers in this filament increase more and reaching values greater than even 1. Okay, now we're moving one order further, which is even more complicated if you have only scattered data, but we have seen that we have to be very careful with the interpretation of this. And even like a sign doesn't maybe necessarily tell you anything about the direction of the cascade, but what we are finding is for the third order structure function, if you scale it by the separation difference, so it should, if you have an inverse cascade, then you would expect a positive plateau here. And for a forward cascade, you would expect a negative plateau. And this is actually plotted here with minus, with a minus sign. So this is actually negative. And so, yeah, this is what we are getting. So arguably, you can say we do get this plateau for those two places. Now you can also compare this. You can actually derive an energy transfer rate from this. You can compare it to what other people have found. So all the other people have actually used a different kind of buoy. Those were buoys that were deployed very close to the surface. So they monitor more the surface, really surface currents, whereas we, for the first time, were actually diagnosing it from the buoys at 15-meter depth. And yeah, so you can compare it to those values, and maybe not so interesting right now. Okay, now I'm going into a field where I'm not an expert, but I'm showing you the results. And we can look at some PDFs. And so my understanding is, right, so if you have a non-zero third order structure function, then you need to have some form of skewness in your PDFs of your velocity difference. Right, so if you would have a totally Gaussian distribution, you would not get any net contribution to your third order structure function. And this is what you see here for the diffusive regime for these kind of scales. And you can plot this PDF and you can look at if you find some skewness. And so what Julia has done is she has now looked at actually the anti-symmetric structure functions that are quantified in this way. And what we actually see is that they agree with a Kolmogorov prediction. So also these higher order moments. And so we think that means that it is a little more evidence that this PDF is from a turbulent process. But I'm happy to get more insight on this. And another thing that you can actually do is, so there's the Richardson-Obukhov constant that is here in this Richardson law as a factor. And then you also have this energy dissipation rate that you can diagnose. So in theory, you can calculate this Richardson number here. And when you do that, you arrive at your value that is about 0.11. And what you find in laboratory experiments, it's typically a value of about 0.5. Now, there are also other predictions for this Richardson-Obukhov constant that varies in orders of magnitude. And so what we find is a reduction of pair dispersion. So our value is lower for a given level of fluctuating energy. And so one question is G universal in the ocean? So that's a question that could be addressed if you can get at this epsilon with the structure function method. So this is ongoing work with a lot of question marks. So now I have a summary of observations, and this is a very cautionary tale, but all that I can say is I can give you some ideas if the results are consistent. So we have the Richardson regime. It is from 20 to about 200 kilometers. It is actually consistent with a positive third order structure function, which would then be consistent with an inverse kinetic energy cascade. And this also is actually consistent with the dominance of the rotational component from the ship ADCP data. Then for scale smaller, 20 kilometers, the divergent and rotational parts of the ADCP data are comparable. Then we also actually for these scales get a negative third order structure function, which could be consistent with the forward kinetic energy cascade. And it's actually also consistent with dissipation rates that are estimated from glider data. The only thing that is not consistent, so the other consistent thing is actually for the spectra, the 2/3 scaling of the second order structure function for these two regimes. So the thing that is not consistent is that the Lagrangian dispersion shows for these scales actually a non-local regime. So this would be more consistent with steep spectral slopes. But as I said, this is a cautionary tale. And yeah. So the PDFs are Gaussian for large scales, for diffusive scales. But so just by looking at them visibly like this, it's hard to tell. And I mean, we need to do more analysis, I think. And so you could, they're not Gaussian, I think, but so you have to have a skewness, and that's why Julia did sort of this, looking at these anti-symmetric structure functions and the scaling for higher orders. And there we actually see a scaling that is predicted.
Now the previous slide, that expression that you showed, I think that's for 2D turbulence, right? That she and B, is that for 2D turbulence?
This one here?
Yes.
I think it is for 2D turbulence.
Right, so for 2D now there's no intermittency, but you're saying there is intermittency in the flow, right?
So there, we have to be very careful with the interpretations, right? So there, I think we have to look further, and I have an outlook at the end. So for example, I'm also going to show you some results from a master thesis. So she took the satellite data, right, where we know we can diagnose from the spectral fluxes inverse cascade. And so this is shown here. So this is the Southern Ocean. No, not Southern Ocean, South Atlantic Ocean. And now you can also calculate this energy transfer rate from the structure function method. And so you see that there are similar patterns, but you should note that so those points are regions where you actually get a positive structure function, but there are many regions where you don't even get a positive structure function. So you have to be very careful with the structure function method, and so more work, I think, is needed. And I have gone kind of slowly in this second fast. And so there is more work to be done, I think, on comparing spectral methods with the structure function method. And so this is what we want to do in our big project, where already slides were shown by Moritz and also Zoe. So we had 2 additional cruises that took place in the South Atlantic in the Walrus Ridge region, so which is around here. It's close, well, on this picture, close to the Benguela upwelling region. And so there we actually deployed drifters that are at 2 different depth levels. So those surface drifters that are at the very surface. And then we also have these deep drifters. We have shown the results before. And I think it is, so what we want to do is, so I think it's important to have different kinds of measurements in one region. So we also, again, then have different gliders and different kinds of instruments than in the ocean to come up with maybe even some form of an energy budget that could be quantified in this region. We will never be able to have a closed budget, but we want to see if our estimates are consistent using all of those different measurements. And then for the interpretation, we are also, it's also really instrumental to use these very high resolution models. So Moritz has shown already results from that. So we are also going to use this high resolution telescope simulation. It has this very high resolution on this Walrus Ridge region with floats deployed in there. And we hope to contribute to the Eulerian-Lagrangian structure function comparison and also spectra structure function comparison. And the other thing that is really important is actually that we want to, of course, understand the physics. So you can talk a lot about spectral slopes, but they don't, maybe are kind of boring, because what you want to know is the actual physical processes behind them, right? And so we want to address this question, which flow components and dynamical processes contribute. And with that, I'm already finished, and this already connects actually to Manita's talk, where she is going to talk about flow decompositions. So thanks very much.
Okay, so we have lots of time for questions. So feel free to ask questions, well, maybe questions for some early career researchers, part 1 or part 2. Do you have any questions?
Well, so you started by saying submesoscales are very important, energetic, but I don't know if we got into submesoscale tracer diffusivity. You showed mesoscale tracer diffusivities and how they change, but what do you think happens at submesoscales? How much is that contributing to tracer diffusivity?
Right. So I've shown right earlier that we had this 50% contribution, and so part of this, okay, so I think, so this is basically the pseudo trajectories that would be from, if you subtract the daily satellite velocities, right? So this would be really your main mesoscale component. Now this character is like about 25 kilometers in 1 day. So those are contributions that come from below that scale, right? So part of that will still be balanced. But of course, if you would zoom into these trajectories here, you see the dominant signal here are inertial oscillations. No, I think they don't, since they are mainly circles, right? So they don't really contribute much to the diffusivity. But you see there are maybe kinds of other submesoscale structures that could contribute.
Hi, Alexa.
Rossby number as a function of scale, right?
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? What are the Rossby numbers we are looking at? Is it small or order 1?
Yeah, so they are not QG anymore. So right, so this was this deployment that is in the filament where you have large gradients. So we have really large velocity gradients and velocity shear. So of course you're going to get larger Rossby numbers, and they are in the order. So they are larger than 0.5. They're not. So they're reaching, I think, 1 here.
Carsten?
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering about the significance of this particular estimate. You have only a few trajectories, right? And if they would go by chance a little bit different, then if this would change this Rossby number, for instance.
Sure, it would. Like if it depends on where they are, then, right? So if you, of course, it would be nice to have more, could have more trajectories here, but then they would also still stay in between these eddies, right? Because it's kind of frontogenesis there. And I mean, these were not all the deployments, right? So I'm showing an example of 2 different kinds. But yeah, I mean, what you can do is I think the best error estimate that you can do is with bootstrapping, right? So you see how, yeah, with bootstrapping, excluding drifters or including them. But yeah, this is data. Yeah, I mean the error bars. So this difference is significant with these kinds of drifters.
I had a sort of similar question about the calculation of the diffusivity, sort of from the earlier part of the talk, part 1. I could use it in both parts, but you're basing it on the divergence of these Lagrangian trajectories, right? On the, if you just have a mean flow with no eddies at all, would you get a diffusivity?
No, you would
From
shear dispersion. Like if you have a sheared flow, you would get an increasing, just continuously increasing diffusivity.
Okay, so
that's kind of what I was showing. If you don't subtract the mean flow, right, then in those observed trajectories, you don't get this convergence.
Okay, so sorry, my fault. I dozed off or something.
Yeah. Here. So to be able to estimate the whole tensor, it's really important that you subtract the influence of mean dispersion. But then you can actually even estimate all the tensor components. So that's kind of the message here.
Do you mind going back to the bit where you compare the spectral flux with the structure functions? So that's your MSc students' thesis. So do you? So I'm just seeing about getting the point. So the third order structure function. So the 2 should be similar. They're supposed to measure similar things, but they don't necessarily have to give you the same results.
Yeah. So they give you the similar patterns, but the magnitude is difficult to compare. Right. And in theory, it should be the same. But then even the sign is not consistent. So you have to be really careful with the interpretation even of the sign of the third order structure function.
Yeah, I asked because I recently recommended this as a reviewer, and I'm slightly, maybe I shouldn't have done it.
Recommended the method?
Yeah, or they should do it. I think they did the right but not the left. I said, well, maybe you should do the left as well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, kind of showing a negative result, so you have to do this. It's important to do this in science, right? Can't always show what matches. So gives you the open questions.
Any more questions? So if not, I think we can maybe close this session and let's.
Well, thanks very much.